So let's go right into it. Hello, I'm Denise Reiner, Director and Curator of Orality. Today's conversation between Morgan Guerin, James Harry, Michelle-Marie Letelier, and Paz Gubara is part of an exhibition and conversation series guest curated by Paz Gubara and developed with artist Michelle-Marie Letelier and Orality. The series Poethics of a Sovereign Ocean, Orality, Reciprocity, and Geopolitical Trajectories, 2021, features conversations with Michelle-Marie Letelier, Paz Gubara, Morgan Guerin, James Harry, David Alday and Ánde Somby, which will be accessible from our website. These conversations are in connection with the exhibition, Am I Ancient or Human-Made Machine, which is on view at Orality from August 28th through October 2nd. The conversations will continue to be accessible on our website, orgallery.org. There are many people to thank, but at this point, I would like to mention in particular Jutta Brendemühl and the Goethe Institute in Toronto for their support of this project. As well, I would like to thank the Blue Cabin Residency for their support of Michelle-Marie's work and by extension, this project. Before we start the conversation in earnest, I would like to acknowledge that I myself and Orality are located in so-called Vancouver, Canada, which is comprised of the still unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I would further like to acknowledge that as we record this, many of us reaffirm our solidarity with the First Nations and our shame at the terrible legacy of the residential school system and what was done in the name of this country, where I currently live and work, Canada. Every child matters. As is the case with online conversations, each of us are speaking from different locations, so I would like to invite each of today's speakers to introduce themselves and let us know where they are joining from. Full bios can be found in the video description. Let's start with Paz Gubara.
Hello, dear group, and especially Denise, thank you for the warm introduction and also the political and historical introduction. And thank you to my accomplice, Michelle-Marie, that we have been thinking, imagining, unsettling this project together with Denise since 2 or maybe even 3 years. Thanks to James Harry and Morgan Guerin to start we hope this conversation with us. I'm a curator, but I come from literature, in fact, so from the writing medium. And since this is a medium also that is, since I know from a country that has been a colonial region as well, this is something that I improvised for you, and thanks for your introduction, Denise. A colony that claimed independence in 1810. I tell you as friends, like it would be in a circle now, like an intimate circle, but knowing and with a bit of anxiety that I know that this circle will be shared. And this claim of the Republic of Equality and Fraternity, of course, has to be contested, because in this claim, not everybody received the equality, especially Indigenous community. So I want to acknowledge that in the place that I born, and from my sensibility and also my intellectual work that I have done, I have dig these histories. I attempt to contribute for some kind of awareness and provocations from what, in a humble way, I do. And especially I want to share with you now, like something contemporary, that with Michelle-Marie and yesterday with David Alday, we have talked, a representative of the Yaghan indigenous community in the south of Chile, is the process of an assembly that is changing the neoliberal constitution. And in this change is also the plan, the program, the agenda that indigenous people and the different groups could be acknowledged as a plurinational state. So with this ongoing debate that I see with optimism, I would like to introduce myself, especially in this project that is about the conversation on the sovereignty of the ocean an ocean that we know because we are from the same America. You are from the north and we are from the south. It has been seen as a medium of imperialism, a medium of colonialism, of conquest, of wrong imaginaries, of misunderstandings. How many times we are misunderstood, exoticized, you say in good English, and how to see the same medium, these waters, the oceans and the rivers, as a space of respect, what histories we can tell. The orality is so important. I know that Morgan had been dealing with this, and of course James with the iconography and the context, what it means, these histories of the rivers, of the oceans. So this, in a very like a generous but also innocent way, I would like to share from my side, to open up. I have been 2 years ago by an invitation by Denise Riner in your region, and I would like to acknowledge the generosity of Denise and the intellectual precision to follow the debates. For me, it was very important to do a tour through the Museum of Anthropology with Terry Point that I want to remember today. And he showed me as a curator the challenges, how to acknowledge the violence of museums that we also debate in my profession and my practice, not only profession, in my everyday, in my dreams, and the kind of strategies how to open it up. So with these two movements, perhaps acknowledging the violence, the limits, but what can we do? What strategies can we do? Is that I wake up every day to do something. And if this something is a great conversation with Michelle-Marie, with Denise Riner, with James Harry, with Morgan Guerin, it's like more than a wonderful day. It's like a day that I will remember forever. And thanks to Terry Point to welcome me that day. And with this very improvised, because in South America, we still don't have this very precise acknowledgement of the personal political cartography. But I have, thanks to you, to start shaping it. And in fact, in my seminar that I do at the Weissensee Art School in Berlin, I call it this way: how can we work our personal political cartography? So I'm very inspired by you. And as a literature person, I want to have this text or this orality that I'm training, and it's a bit vulnerable because it's not ready. This way I want to greet you and welcome you in the circle, and I hope to hear a lot more from you. And now I pass it to my dear long-term friend and accomplice, artist and thinker, Michelle-Marie Letelier.
Thank you so much, Paz. It's like, I'm gonna start crying now. It's like, amazing. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Denise, also for the introduction. And thank you, James and Morgan, for being here and for accepting this invitation. Although we don't know each other yet, hopefully we will be physically in the same place next year, I hope. And I would like to briefly introduce myself. I know you haven't been to the exhibition yet, but I'm a Chilean artist based here in Berlin. I live here since 14 years now, and I came directly from Santiago. I've been living in many, many places in Chile. I lived in the biggest open pit copper mine in the world in the middle of the Atacama Desert, and that experience when I was between 8 years and 16 years, that shaped my artistic life, because it was a very, very strong experience in every term. And since then, I decided to devote myself to work with natural resources. First, I worked with copper. When I came here to Germany, I wanted to work with coal. And then I spent many years, and I'm still spending a lot of time researching on saltpeter, the trade of saltpeter, and the relationship that has with wind, because it was transported in the last wind vessels. So as you see, it's like a lot of materiality around the subjects that I work, and in a very, very long-term way, with a lot of research into the history of the trade of each mineral or each resource, and the meaning, the historical meaning in the place, the changing of the landscape where they are exploited, and the speculation they have around the world. So there's a lot of relationship between micro and micro and macro standpoints around the resources that I investigate. Since 6 years now, I've been researching into salmon, and it was kind of like a coincidence how I came to research salmon. A Norwegian curator invited me to a group exhibition in 2016, and that exhibition dealt around the concept of ocean. They were dissecting a piece of the law in Norwegian law that said that living marine resources belong to the society as a whole. And what does it mean to belong to society as a whole? So they started to analyze this, it was very interesting. They were inviting politicians, poets, philosophers, artists, people from many, many disciplines. So for that, I was into saltpeter, but then I thought, what does it have saltpeter to do with Norway? Maybe nothing. So I started to research into the Norwegian resource management, let's say, and then I came to the fact that Norway and Chile are the main salmon producers in the world, and both countries is the second income after copper in Chile and oil in Norway. So that fact struck me, and I felt the need to continue researching. So since then, I've been devoted practically the whole time to finding out more about what is salmon, what is this species, and what is the value of salmon as an ancient species, and why it's so important in the global north, and in the northern hemisphere, and why so is seen as an enemy in the southern hemisphere. So this project is basically about putting in dialogue the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere in terms of salmon as an ancient species, but also as a neocolonial tool, unfortunately. And that in regards to ancient dialogues, in terms of how can we find alternative to our mindsets as a contemporary society that is depleting the whole planet. So yeah, that's more or less what is the project about, and from that is a lot of research, as I said, but also it's some specific artworks. I don't devote myself to any specific medium. It depends on the idea. So for example, I've been doing a bit of reality. The other artwork, let's say, is called the bonding, which is this attempt to have a relationship with a captive salmon, as a genetically modified salmon, that a group of salmon that are swimming in the tank in the Institute of Marine Research in Norway. And that will end in February next year with a 60mm film and a digital material. I don't know what to do if that's gonna end in a long-term, in a long film or installation. And so it also has a technocritical side of the. I would like to see. I would like to pick. I'm picking some technologies, different technologies that also speak in a critical way about science and the use of the technology as well. So yeah, and then the other part is a residence in Chile that I will be having in November this year. And of course, the residency in Vancouver that unfortunately has been postponed for 2 years now because of COVID. So I hope to be there next year. Yeah. Thank you. maybe we continue with James.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I was going to ask Paz if you could actually bring up that image that we had earlier. And I can speak to that and just kind of start the kind of conversation there. But while that's coming up, I guess I can just introduce myself. My name is James Harry. I share the name Xwalacktun with my father, who's accomplished artist himself. And he's actually my mentor as well. And I've learned under him pretty much over my whole life. He's taught many other artists who are all accomplished in their own right at this time. So yeah, so on my father's side, my father's mom, she's Kwakwaka'wakw, coming from Alert Bay. And my dad's dad is Squamish Nation. So a lot of what I've been trying to bring in is just place and identity and decolonizing spaces with my practice. So let me just rewind a little bit here. I started carving with my dad when I was about 5 years old, and I've worked with him on various projects around the world, locally, creating carvings such as house posts and panels, engaging with the public. So a lot of the work that he's been doing that I've been kind of subject to through him is sort of this socially engaged art where we're educating people about our culture and our land. So, you know, we've been to Scotland doing this, the UK, we've been to the US, various parts of the US and all around Canada. And really what I find that we've been doing this whole time is just every time we come up into the public sphere, that we're educating people on our ways of knowing, particularly, which I think is really interesting in terms of what you were talking about earlier, was how salmon have been such an integral part to ways of life for Indigenous people since time immemorial. And it's just like this interconnectedness that, you know, with the land, with the other animals that feed off of the salmon, to the nutrients they provide to the trees when their carcasses have been eaten and rotting across, and all those nutrients spreading across the land, is so complex in ways that we couldn't really fathom. And this is like the first time in history where we've started to sort of disrupt this really complex ecosystem. And that's sort of where I have been interested in creating these artworks in public spaces, in this case, outside of Cineplex Cinemas, which is sort of an interesting conversation there in its own, because you have all these, you have a mall here, which this mall has been built on top of our old village, Kamulchison, which translates to fast moving water fish. So that's sort of what this sculpture is doing. It's still telling a story that's related to place and our identity. So what you see there is a salmon with its eggs, and it sort of circles around the house post, as like this idea that everything is kind of swimming in unison and everything's connected. And then the eggs on the side there represent the cycle of the salmon's life. So it's every 4 years coming back, and yeah, so it's really just trying to, you know, we're here, you see this photo here, we're doing protocol, and we're acknowledging that this new artwork is going up, and blessing it and doing ceremony around it. And that's what happens every time we put up a new work, that we have certain protocols that we go by in order to kind of acknowledge the work that's being done, from paying witnesses. What we used to do is we paid witnesses to come by paying them with a blanket. So you see everybody here is wearing a blanket over their shoulder to acknowledge the speakers, as well as the artist, as well as the dancers and performers. And really it's just acknowledging the protocols around our ways of life. And again, like I was saying earlier, just teaching and educating people about sort of Indigenous epistemologies and ways of knowing. So it's an ongoing kind of, there's always lots of work to be done around this, because when I know it's easy to say from an Indigenous perspective that we already know what we need to do in order to preserve what we need. So it sort of feels like this never-ending message that we're trying to tell to the world, that we need to protect what we have in order for the future generations to have it. So I can maybe open it up to the next part of the conversation. Maybe if Morgan wanted to maybe add to something I was talking about there.
That sounds good. Thanks, James. Yeah, first I'll introduce myself. My name is Morgan Guerin. My ancestral name is Setsuleno, by way of my great-grandmother, who's from Lummi Nation. Born and raised in the Musqueam Nation. Very, very happy to be here to share a bit of my the teachings that have been passed along to me. And it's a very important role that we have to keep knowledge from one generation to the next. James and I, we come from people who are our oral histories are a very, very proud structure that we have from passing our history from one generation to the next. And in some ways far superior than even the written version, because the context is also provided when the oral tradition passes from one generation to the next. It's not a perception. Your grandma will tell you exactly what that meant. So the words come with the context as well. So I'm very, very happy to be here to share some of that. In Musqueam, I work as the senior marine planning specialist. And I also do the enforcement coordination for Musqueam. So I look after the rivers and the lands and speak on behalf of the Musqueam people, technical capacity for those. I've served on Musqueam Council for 3 terms, and very, very happy to sit in that role to be a speaker for the Musqueam people. For the last 22 years, working in our fishery department, prior to working in the role that I am now, I worked as a Aboriginal fishery officer for Musqueam, which is a varied role. It's really the focus point of who we are as a people. Stewardship, looking after Mother Earth around us, passing along those teachings with a modernized title for a very, very ancient role. So I'm very, very happy to have worked and continue to do that work, because we're always taught that as our Huamuk people, which is our word for our Indigenous people, you have a right that is assured, but more importantly, you have a responsibility. And without acting on the responsibility, the right can go away. So for a long time, though, we have been denied the right to actually actively participate in stewardship through colonization. And it's only actually very recently that the conversation has changed, where you need to consult First Nations. And Musqueam, I'm very happy to say, is one of the leaders in making sure that that conversation happened. We took the federal government to court in the late 80s, and in the early 90s, a decision was handed down to the Supreme Court of Canada against one of our members, Ron Sparrow. And it was deemed what we already knew, that the Musqueam people have an Aboriginal right to fish. And that if you're going to impact that Aboriginal right to fish, you must consult the nation. And of course, that is stemmed into every facet of the environment and stewardship. So what an amazing time to be, for myself as a young man, to have grown up in that environment, surrounded by these leaders who spent a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of resource in order to make sure that those teachings that we have always held as a core belief of who we are over millennia after millennia in this area, millennia, to be upheld in a westernized perspective in the Canadian courts. And I know that that case has even been cited across the Commonwealth. So very, very happy to be here today to share a bit of who I am, what I've been taught. Like my dear relative, James, coming from our Squamish, who are our very, very close cousins. That's our family. I say Musqueam in Vancouver, we're Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. We're 3 nations, but we are one family. So, and yes, to further that conversation of, I mean, if we take one piece, we talk about salmon. It's a way to open a conversation to the much larger world about everything is connected in the way that we're taught. To anyone who's wants to Google what the Musqueam Flag looks like, you can see the importance of salmon. In fact, I believe I've got it on my coffee cup this morning. So we have a salmon inside of a net, inside of an arrowhead. So the importance of that cycle of life to the Musqueam people. The salmon's lives for the nourishment that they have provided us, the immense culture that we've built up at the basin of, which is now known as the Fraser River. To us, it's Stotlow, which literally translates to river. And people wonder, why such simplicity? Is that primitive? It's not. If Mother Earth is your mother, you don't name elbows after other people. It's just elbow. It's just hair. You don't need to call it something else. So it's not primitive. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's at a very, very core level of respect for the environment around you. So when we speak of place names in our area, often they talk about what's describing Mother Earth in those areas, the resources that are on the cool waters, the springs, much as my cousin just referred to, the place of fast water and fish, right? It doesn't need to be brought to you by and then put somebody else's name in. Mother Earth already had a name. So respecting that cycle of life and how it interacts with your cycle of life and how delicate it can be too as well. So I'm very, very happy to be here today to jump into that conversation a bit too as well. So, thank you to you all.
Thank you as well, Michelle. So perhaps we could share very shortly with James and Morgan one of the impulses that draw us to develop these conversations. So with Michelle, we have been thinking on these questions that I share in the screen for helping us to go together. Since we are all at distance, we come together in this format, in this moment, in this reunion that I appreciate very much. So we have been thinking, how do exhibitions have the capacity to create these moments of communality, rather than objectifying the beings that enter into its modern grid. For example, the salmon, but also other beings. Like we have been debating that the exhibitions, museum frameworks have this unfortunate capacity to transform everything in an object, to displace it from life, from function, from context, as we were talking with James earlier. And how does the exhibition then, in opposition to that model, how can we contribute to change this modern, very strict grid? How does the exhibition become permeable to life? Like, for example, also to conversations, permeable to life through orality, that is so important of what we're doing, but also permeable to reciprocity, and not only to go and observe, not only to go and contemplate, but to activate. And in connection with geopolitical trajectories, struggles, and potential alliances, that we are in a humble but active way, we are also trying to establish what we share, what ideas, agendas, groups, between the North and the South, according to the conversations that we're having. So yesterday we started with this reflection, the conversation, and then as a first impulse to make one round of this, acknowledging these limits of exhibitions, but also how can we start to perforate them and connect them with life struggles and context. Would you like to comment very freely if you have certain experiences dealing with this format and that you would like to share with us, but of course with the listeners as well? Morgan or James?
Yeah, I don't mind starting if that's
fantastic.
Yeah, no, I especially when we talk about exhibition, like the actual portraying of something too as well, and like my relative James is showing his beautiful artwork, actually showing those pieces in place, right? And for we Indigenous people who were raised with the teachings that were given in the area, like my relative alluded to earlier, these are things that are firsthand for us. They're commonplace. The sky is blue, right? We all know that, so we don't really talk about it too often, except in passing. But when these conversations to a different population who have learned through a subculture to sort of disassociate themselves from the environment around them, these aren't. And it's not just a matter of showing, like, say, I'm going to put a piece up that not only the Squamish people were here, and this is our word for these areas, the Musqueam people were here, and these are words for us. But it also goes to show some of those intricacies of how all those things are tied together. And then a lot of it is a perspective to then let the rest of humanity sort of see that you also are tied to this as well. With those rights come those responsibilities. Do not disassociate yourself from them. If we start looking at the loss of chains of life, which is happening right now. My grandfather, when he was a child, lived, there's a river just behind me. And it is the mouth of what's now known as the Fraser River. And he lived in his little house and village across the river from where the main village is here now. And he tried to walk on the backs of the salmon to get to the other side of the river to go see his cousin. And that's the abundance that was here in about 1914, 1915. One of my grandaunts had to stop him and say, no, you can't do that. But he was sure that he could. To his mind, there was just a wall that he could walk on the back of. Now, I'm sitting in here in my position, speaking on behalf of Mother Earth, who doesn't have a voice, speaking with the context of the stewards of this land for the last 10 millennia at least, and more, and counting, or as we like to say, since time immemorial. Bringing those teachings that Mother Earth has given us about how to look after her. So when we have these sort of, and I always say, and now the salmon crisis that we're having for the Fraser River stream is we have the lowest returns of salmon in recorded history now. So if you look at the juxtaposition of from grandfather to grandson, we've gone from an abundance that people could only imagine, and within 100 years, to not only a species which is on the brink of collapse, complete collapse for all generations to come, where we might be telling stories rather than the continuation of let's go down and see. So these exhibits I mean, in our own traditional ways, we had our neighbors to the north had totem poles, and our Hunkaminam speaking people had house posts, and those house posts were actual structural pieces that held your home up, but the histories on them were that of your ancestors or your ancestors' teachings, guiding you, reminding you of who you are. And yes, it wasn't to it wasn't to turn it into an objectify, but rather, that's your grandpa, that's your grandma. Oh, that's the teachings of your ancestors. There's no objective. That's just who they are. And then, like my relative is moving forward, he's the modern version of those history keepers. He's creating the bookmarks for the actual the books to open up. And as I said, as that oral history moves along, you need those bookmarks to go, what's that about? Sit down, grandson, and let me tell you a story. Right? Here's the history of this river. Because we speak, those who are raised in the traditional ways, we understand that the earth and her rivers, that's our mother, that's her body and her blood. In fact, in our language, we say Hualmuk, which refers to a First Nation person, but Hualmuk actually translates to you belong to the earth. So there's no race in there. It's how you live your life and your understanding of how you're connected. So when you say Hualmuk, that's your mother. So my cousin's piece showing the river there, to us, to all the relatives outside of there, we'll walk in there and go, oh, well, let me tell you a story about this piece of your Mother Earth, your mother, your relative, the one who looks after you. So yes, but the perception of to the outside world, how do we stay away from that? From, say, a Westernized perspective, absolutely, that becomes a little trickier. I do work with museums around the world, one in New York that everybody kind of knows of, for instance. And we're working very, very hard and diligently to tell our story. So to take belongings off the wall that shouldn't be there, and the ones that do remain, to have us tell their story. Instead of, here's the thing that we discovered about these people. And in that, it's not us telling our story most of the time, it's us telling Mother Earth's story from the teachings that we've been given for the last 1,000 years. One of my favorite teachings that was given to me by one of my elders are, these are not my words, son. It's just my turn to say them. And someday they'll be your turn to say them. And that's very, very important for that transition of history. So yes, and how do they fit into this sort of way that we are now? The loss of salmon to the Musqueam people would be like the loss of buffalo to our plains relatives too as well. If you remove that food chain, you remove those people from their connection to Mother Earth. They'll move their connection to the resource, and once they're away, then it can be exploited. So that is something that has always been very much at the forefront, and why we have fought very, very diligently to make sure that we protect Mother Earth in these areas, so that our classroom is also retained, so that the next time I bring my nieces and nephews, my grandchildren out in the future, the classroom will be there. You're walking on your mother. Be careful, be light, take what you need. She'll provide for you, but here's the rules. That's much better to teach in the classroom than at a kitchen table. So, and I think we're past the era where we're limited to hiding while we transition our teachings. So we need to move into an era where it's free. So, and a lot of those pieces, that story is told through art. As I said, they're the bookmarks that move from place to place for the keepers of the history to walk up and say, let me tell you the history of that grandchild. So a few words on that.
Thank you. This is very important to how you see in an intergenerational modus as a transition. it gives this acknowledging to the history, but also of the own agency of our time and for the future to come. So it's generous, but does not forget also the problems of history. So Michelle, if you agree, we can pass to James and you can comment to pass it to him.
Can I just make an observation, because it was from when you were talking, Morgan, so beautifully. I'm really fascinated by the complexity of the value of the materiality that you all share, and I really identify with that, because for me it's the same. It's like when I work with materials, it's very important which material that I pick, and the poetry of that every materiality and the origin of the materiality that has in the artwork. So this is just an observation that I would really like to continue in the future, if it's possible to know more. When you were talking about the posts, for example, it's not a post, it's your relative, it's Mother Earth. So I'm really grateful to be in conversation with you, and I really acknowledge and identify with this value, this poetic value of the material, and how we relate with the material in order to construct and maintain the stories. So yeah, this is just, I wanted to say that.
No, for sure. I think just one extra little piece is myself. I'm known as an artist. I have a hard time accepting that as who I am, because mine's very different. I'm more of a tool maker. I create the fishing tools and implements that we made prior to contact. So I create harpoons for sturgeon fishing, spears that we did. I knap the rocks down to make the spearheads, or carve them out of bone in the traditional way with the tools that we used prior to contact. And it's very important to me, because it's not a matter of losing it as an art per se, but the connection that you have to Mother Earth. Where did you get the proper stone to create that? So not just in the actual piece itself, which is very much included in there, but also your connection to the earth. You know, as I said, those place names we're talking about. We have a place name called the Place of the Abrader Stones. Why would that be so important? Why would why would we need to know where there's rocks that you could grind something down? Why would that be so fundamentally important? But then as you work towards creating the tools that you need, you find out how important a good abrader stone actually is to sharpening a tool, to grinding down things into the shape that you want. And you understand. So then that place isn't just, a place of rocks. You understand the significance and importance of why that would have had to have been kept in a good way. And to disrupt the cycle of life, be it the tree standing, to make these harpoon posts, the deer that gave up its bones, or even to disrupt the place of taking that rock from its place, removing it from its home that it's known for before you've even existed, and now we know to be millions of years, to become part of the tool. The responsibility that goes with that too, and then that transition of teaching. So sense of place that goes with a lot of these two. So absolutely, yes, it's something I think that rings true for all of us who are born, and our people are very much connected to the earth. So
yeah, I guess just to sort of talk about what Morgan was talking about with sense of place. So the whole reason that I got into public art, I mean, when I went to Emily Carr, I was really involved in doing more installation works in gallery spaces. And I found that like doing work that way was coming more from a Western and colonial perspective. And we never really had our artwork on display like that. In fact, we didn't even have a word for art. It was just a way of life. And, you know, like my cousin was saying, Morgan here, is that, you know, you would represent your family and those teachings in your house, and those were the values that held up your house. So you were reminded of that on a daily basis, you know. And so, you know, we didn't look at that like it was a piece of artwork on a wall. It had a much deeper and historical sense to it, where it's, yeah, it reminded you of your ancestors, the ones that came before and the ones that will come after, because you have to pass on those teachings to them someday. And yeah, that's where you know, those teachings come from our elders, and we always had the highest regard and respect for our elders, because they have all the knowledge. They're the knowledge keepers. So I found that really difficult when I was going to Emily Carr to try and translate whatever those teachings I had into the institution. So I knew that going afterwards that I wanted to get into public art, because that would start to bring the conversation to the land itself. And there were so many stories around here that we're not telling, or, you know, historically coming from that colonial perspective, that we haven't had the space to, and only until very recently are we able to start to tell our story in public spaces, in ways that can change people's perspectives. And the reason for that house post that I created there, Xwalacktun, the reason I started using metal was because at the same time, I knew the day was going to come when we couldn't use red cedar or yellow cedar anymore. And that's also something that's, you know, that day has come now as well. We can't carve old growth trees because there are none left. You know, my dad's generation was sort of the last kind of generation to have that. So it's not just the salmon, it's everything. You know, all the resources are starting to dwindle, and I can still offer that perspective coming from that Indigenous perspective of, you know, this is our storytellings, this is what still represents our land and our history, and doing it through new material, which is kind of scary at the same time, right? Because it's also, you know, taking away the trees is also like taking away our salmon. So, you know, that was just our way of life. We use the tree for its bark, its inner bark for weaving, its outer bark we used every part of the tree, right? Nothing was ever wasted. And so it's all connected, and that's kind of what I was trying to get to before, was that it was just this story of interconnectedness and ways of knowing that are connected to, you know, our elders teaching us these things. We didn't question it. It was just a way of life for us. So that's my 2 cents anyways.
Thank you. Michelle, would you like to do a round, or I can share also a work that James did?
I would like to ask you, James, because I was looking at your work, your website, and you also use copper. So I didn't know that there was copper in this zone. So it's really a nice discovery to know that you're also, copper is an important part of your work. So would you explain that, why and how is the interconnectedness using copper in your work, but also that reflects the identity of the culture over there?
Yeah, for sure. Copper has been one of the, I love using copper. It's one of the materials I like using the most, actually. To answer your question about that, it's very, well, copper represented wealth, and usually it was the higher ranking chiefs that would have it in the form of a copper shield. And that would be usually traded or given as gifts to chiefs at weddings or really big events or markers in somebody's life. So there was that aspect to it. And the way I look at it is that, like, copper represents wealth, but not the sort of wealth that you would think of as, you know, you have all this money it was in a form of that you have all these people in your life, and people who can carry you in a way. And it's sort of like this, to me, it represents like community and teachings and being connected to people close to you. You know, wealth in the sense that we had all the salmon to fish and all the berries, and, you know, before the land was intoxicated by the ships that are passing by and the oils they're spilling into the waters. And you know, we used to be able to gather sea life across the shore. It'd be mussels and clams, and you know, the tide goes down and you could just harvest them. Doing that now, it's everything would be, you wouldn't want to do that now, right? So yeah, it's sort of this, wealth in the sense that you have this abundance in resources, and paying respect to it, and holding it true to you. So that's what it represents to us and me as well. I can, maybe Morgan might be able to speak more on that as well.
Yeah, thanks, James. Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think I referenced earlier, like a connection to the salmon, and having that immense biomass come past our doorstep, and having that understanding of stewardship and looking after it. And so when people talk about economics, they get a westernized perspective of, you know, take only what you need. You know, it's not to mean to just take yourself to a point where you just aren't starving. That's not life, right? So I know here, right off here, we have just about a mile up the river from me is a village of Sesnam, which is home to the world's largest midden, which is, of course, to others, it's an ancestral garbage dump, but to us, it's actually locking in history. Because if you were to plant bone into the soil in my backyard, within 100 or 200 years, Mother Earth would reclaim the bone, it would rot and go back into the earth. Except in that midden, which is composed of clamshells. So you eat the clams, you eat the oyster shells, these sort of things that go in. It actually creates an environment which locks things into time. So we have our belongings from our ancestors, which are many thousands of years old. In fact, there are many pieces that predate the pyramids by 1,000 years in this area. So you can cut a section out of it and you see time. And this connection that James was just talking about, like copper, right? And on around here we had mountain goat wool, as well as horn and jade being traded in, which isn't from here, it's from more upriver. And these pieces, I mean, you would have your swoke with your blanket woven out of there. And I mean, how many of these do you see kicking around here right now? Not a whole lot. You know, in a delta, you don't see, you know, mountain goats and mountain sheep and all these, you know, tall mountain creatures. And imagine having a blanket made of completely that. Well, that shows that you have connections far and wide. And you might have your pendant, which is an adze made out of jade around your neck. It also shows that connection far and wide. You might have obsidian on the end of your spear. And what Sesnam, what we've always known through our oral histories, and that was, if you drop a pin in the epicenter of Coast Salish territory, dead smack in the middle of it, we're sitting here right now, my cousin and I. And the village of Sesnam, through that midden, we saw the immense amount of trade that came from all around, which includes trade that came from out on the plateaus and the prairies. A lot of that obsidian now, through our oral histories, have always said, and now we've got Western science coming in going, yeah, you were right. We tested the isotopes, and yes, they're from Utah. This obsidian's from Utah. And my friend here told me this, and she's all excited, and she goes, and the best reaction I got was Morgan's, because he went, yeah, I know. It's something that's so inherent to us. We know, and it's not to deflate it. I understand you're excited, but the sky is still blue. Once again, the sky is still blue, right? Yeah, I know. It's cool. Good, good. I'm glad you understand the sky is blue now. We've got other things to talk about. and that trade that came in from all over was because of that resource, because of the salmon. You know, our relatives would have a forest fire in the interior and the game would be scarce. They'd come down, can we have some food? Absolutely. Maybe we might set up a marriage. We like this guy, let's send him off, da, 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 da. And you would see this system of beautiful debt that we have in our society. You'd come back a season or two later and they would have mountains of wool picked from the mountains, from the interior for us to weave these. They'd come down with the jade and they would have this beautiful debt if this person looked after us. These people looked after us. And they would keep going until we say a word that we use now for thank you is haichka, but it actually translates to between you and I, haichka, it's done. You're okay. I release you. You know, in my heart, it's done, which is a beautiful sentiment, right? Don't hold on to that anymore. Not that they were holding on to it in a Western way of, oh, I owe this debt. It's a beautiful thing. I owe this person. They held us up. You know, they looked after us. They, you know, they thought we were worthy to be looked after. You know, these sort of things. So those senses of trade, those pieces of art, those little things are all symbols of something so much greater. Not just describing Mother Earth, but our connections to each other too as well. You know, the connection of copper to the north, the connection of jade upriver, these sort of things. And the people that came from all over, the dentalia shells, which were caught on the west coast of Vancouver Island and moved through here and then traded. And then you see all of our prairie relatives wearing them on their dresses. And of course, they don't have an ocean anywhere near them. And it shows this beautiful trade cycle of where all these things came from and how we were all connected to each other through these little symbols of what are referenced as art to the New World, but to us, it was life. It was a sense of connections. Your name, who you are, your story of who you come from, your history of who you come from, and these other little pieces to say, and I belong to Mother Earth. I've taken the wool and I've converted it into love and a prayer, and I've locked those things together and I've put them through together. Like Our Ladies, we call them Slani. Then you break that word down and it's the one who binds things together. Like a weaver, not a weaver. There's a separate word for that, right? But the one who binds things together, like a weaver, who takes the old life and moves it into, and they say that story with those pieces of Mother Earth, which they've then converted into their own art of the weaving that wraps around, the prayer that wraps around. The photos we were showing earlier when they were, and my cousin was speaking about the ceremony, we had the man with the blanket around him. In the old days, that'd be a woven blanket made by the family. That prayer is to protect him from any bad that might be thrown at him so that his words can come out true. So all these little pieces they reference more the connection rather than anything else. Because if you remove the story from that, one of my elders once said something very, very stuck with me, and I'll paraphrase it. But he goes, our longhouses will fall down. Everything will fall down. But so long as your history remains, you will always be there. So, and that's the important part of it. We build these art pieces knowing that they won't stand forever. But so long as the history of what that piece carries forward, that is the most important part. So, and what that connection means. So, there's just a few thoughts I had on that.
Thank you. Michelle, maybe we could share one image by James to connect and ask a further question. I will share. Mm-hmm. So for us, in this us, I also include Denise, as well as Michelle-Marie. It's very important, this conversation, and And when Morgan was speaking, I felt also I come from the same situation from another door and from another region and from other trajectory. And it's so empowering to connect for me, what for me is a question, and perhaps you have a part or great part or total part of the answer. Like I have been researching on the Cold War, so after 1945, and how in the South region in South America, where Michelle-Marie and I were born, many programs supported by the United States came to support modern art. And I was quite struck that in the first lockdown that was around March last year, I found a document of the program Alliance for Progress made by Kennedy in the early 60s. And this program offered a huge aid. So it means a huge money support for all countries of South America to develop the technification of agriculture, the migration from the countryside to the cities, and in culture also to distribute, to empower modern values. And this meant, was not explicitly written, made in the text, but this meant to take out all indigenous culture, folklore, and popular arts. So this was for me like a very clear neo-colonial cut in our history when these programs arrive with one mission, and in fact they apply for the missions. All countries of South America accepted this aid except Cuba, and was Che Guevara still that said it is a form of imperialism. And modern art also function in this way of cutting out the context, and we see that, for example, an abstract work, as we are seeing by James, in fact, is not abstract because it's connected with the context. So how context, the orality, the community, the interconnections is so important, and how this cut of exhibitions, what I was telling before, is also a legacy that a modern legacy that is very limited, that we're trying to unsettle, and not only to work out, like somehow to break it, and how important is this conversation. So I wanted to share this part of the research that I have been doing, but of course also how Michelle-Marie has been doing from her own experience, analyzing how the country had been working with the extractivism of the land, of copper, saltpeter, and now the salmon. And I will stop sharing now to return to the circle, and how in the south, in Chile, the salmon is not the wild salmon that you welcome in your art and in your storytelling and in the Mother Earth and all the stories, but this is the genetically modified farm salmon. So in the south, as we have been talking with Yaghan community representative David Alday, it becomes also a new colonizer because it also threatens the ecosystem and the communities around. So we have been dealing with this conflict, not only in the art, but also in life. So this is a new impulse for around uniting with Michelle-Marie practice and my research, and also Denise is very acknowledged about this. So if you have a question, let us know, because I have been working with Denise here in Berlin very closely, and we share many of these inquiries.
No, for certain. Where you started off was a very, very familiar story. And I think, like Denise was acknowledging the residential school component of what we internationally and as a nation are looking at, but as something that has very much been part of who we are. But it's every once in a while the spotlight shines on something, which is actually a time for healing as a people, even though that's something that we're doing generationally. So, but what is really been hard for many people is understanding how recent those are. And as you're speaking about the situation that you're talking about too in Chile, like this is John F. Kennedy announcing these in the 60s. And this is a man who everybody looks at with light in their eyes and this in an American perspective, but understanding, well, he couldn't have done that, right? That couldn't have been the reason why. And I'm sorry, it is. When the last residential school closed in 1996, I had cousins who are maybe 8 years older than I am, have gone to residential school, right? Do I look like an old man to anybody? My father, grandfather, great-grandfather, all attended, right? So these are not far off. They're not ancient histories, and that colonization is and continues to happen through these things. The removal of art is always one. And we've seen that with our people. We were forbidden from having pieces. There are pieces that we have oral history of here in Musqueam from my family of people coming in saying, you have this sacred mask that only certain families belong to. So, and this is a priest walking in with a constable and one of these archaeologists walking in saying, I heard you have a sacred mask for sale, knowing well that this has a complete contraband, and what the looking at towards the priest and the constable, what happens if you say, no, I don't, or I don't know what you're talking about, what's going to happen next? So then, they're sold off, these sort of things. I have nations up north where they now have dances interpreting that moment of history. They actually have masks of priests done in our traditional way, showing all their goods being brought into the middle of town and being set on fire. That's a dance now, commemorating that piece of history. So, and you're right, to when you take everyone out of these indigenous places and put them in the city centers, well, does that sound not exactly like what we wanted to do here in Canada and the United States with the residential schools? Remove people from where the resources, the untapped resources are, so that we can exploit them to our own benefit, because they're a hindrance in the way. And then get these people to come in and assimilate, so we've got good workers when we do get them. That's exactly what happens. So, no, very, very familiar story. I know our people here on the coast were forbidden from fishing because we were, quite frankly, too good at it. So you were not allowed to commercially fish for many, many years. And then it was only through industry alone that some of those rules started bending, because they wanted the best fishers to come in and fish these stocks. So, you would have to work for a company. So basically you almost belong to a company. So not were you only a ward of the crown, but then you were then further in indentured servitude, belonging to a company as well, just so that you could make a living for your family doing what you knew how to do. So yes, these stories, these histories are all over the world. And I think one of the things that we come to is making sure that this is something that is still happening today. And it is a really hard truth for people to actually see that these things are happening right now. And they happen under people that some people really revere, were actually some of the people who did this, right? So I was left, you never want to meet your heroes. So, but that said, no, when we look at the fabric, that geopolitical fabric across the world, the weave isn't too different when it comes to anything that's colonialism, imperialism, any of these sort of things that interweave, or extraction, because there's always two mindsets. This is a resource and this is Mother Earth. And those two things do not weave very well together. So it is just much easier to rip the blanket in half put the other piece away, call it a reserve, and then continue on with the way we're going to do. And unfortunately, because we're running in a system where money is now the international resource, that's exactly what we're going to continue to fight for many generations to come. So that said, where do we come to an area where the two things cross over and we understand that we have a responsibility with that right? Entitlement is something that you need to forget. This is not an unlimited resource. I love what my cousin did with the sculpture in aluminum. My brother did something very similar, and for a very similar reason. I mean, if you take the salmon go up, they breed and they die. They complete their life circle. The bears feast on them. The bears go into the woods, dragging their carcasses. The bears don't eat everything. They like the high fat parts of it, and they leave the rest, which is still super rich in nutrients. Nutrients that then go into the forest and then repopulate the trees, and then they complete the cycle. So the fact that we have less trees in order to carve and we have less fish is not an accident, but it is beyond belief how hard it is to explain that to the general public and get a consensus of this is a problem, without many people coming in going, yeah, but what if? Well, while you're saying what if, it's still a problem, right? So, and it's something that universally we've seen for many years to be, this is the way. And then we've had this integer where things have changed, and it's that the blanket was ripped. The blanket was ripped. So if we can be stewards, welcoming in 250,000 people into this area, up to 250,000 people would influx into our Delta system during the summer for the salmon. All these protocols and all these collections. You can imagine why this is just an overview today. To within 100 years, being us as people who live this way for many millennia, now having to say, I don't know if I'm going to be able to take my grandchildren fishing, to pass along the knowledge, to be there with Mother Earth, to have those things happen. I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime, and it may not happen in my grandchildren's lifetime. So once again, the house I hold on to that teaching of the longhouses have fallen, our house posts will fall, but so long as our teachings don't. So even though during the residential school we had to put our teachings under the blanket, we're going to have to do something very similar for many generations to come, because the resource itself, unless the rest of the world understands what they're doing to themselves, we're going to continue to have this problem. So we need to retain those teachings. And if we've done it for 10,000 years, fine, I guess we'll do it for another 1,000. But it would be so much better if we had the forest to do it in, if we had the waters to do it in, and if our relatives, the salmon, were fishing beyond this too. So delineating yourself from those is not solving no problems, but it's continuing on the problem that we're seeing. Quit ripping the blanket. Understand that they can weave together.
Thank you, Morgan. James, would you like to weave with the conversation how, because especially you that in the introduction you share with us how the education in art, visual arts, visual already is like a cut. There is only the visual regime, and what happened with the haptic, the other senses, smell, is really restricted. It's a cut. It's like the Western way of display, like display art, that is very much traditionally cut the context from which these artworks belong and are part of. Also cut the orality in favor of the visuality. So it's very in depth with the conversation we are having, and I'm sure you have this community knowledge that contrasts with that, but also your personal experience with the Western model and how you cross it until the position that we are seeing you at your home studio, already with a kind of response, no?
Yeah, I mean, it's all really connected to every facet of what my career has been about. My career and just my everyday life, being part of the community, engaging in the community. And, you know, I've taken the time to work under my mentors and study from them and learn from them. And, you know, that's like our traditional ways of creating, right? You usually had the master artisan, and the younger apprentices would work under them, often, you know, pushing the broom or you know, taking off the bulk of the material, all the stuff that's quite physically physically engaging. So, you know, a lot of those teachings I took from my dad and other mentors, such as Aaron Nelson Moody, and just working through that way of teaching. So like this idea of mentorship has always been really strong in how my work enters into a space, especially in the public sphere, what that means. And yeah, it's always worked, right? It's like every time I'm raising a new artwork, it's educating people on our ways of knowing, our ways of life. I took, you know, taking that time I kind of live and breathe it now because I've been doing it for so long. It's part of my life. And you know, I'll be one day passing that on to the next generation of young artists. And yeah, to speak towards this idea of like imperialism happening here in Canada versus the rest of the world. The way I sort of navigate that is I try and always come at it from like a very positive point of view, because if I kind of dwell my head in negativity and all the atrocities that happened, I would never be able to move forward in a good way or a positive way. And you always have to be kind of, you know, that's sort of what my dad taught me from a younger age is, you know, he's been working with elementary schools and high schools, teaching them about our Coast Salish culture. And it's really, it's really just been trying to like educate people more on Coast Salish designs and iconography. And that sort of portion of the sculpture that you brought up that was like sort of abstracted is also sort of purposeful in the sense that it's like, you know, blown up to this idea that it's just about the shapes. And that's the other part that I was going to get into, is that it, like, our artwork kind of comes out of the land, the way that the designs, like the crescents and the trigons and the ovals and circles that are used throughout, sort of my theory of it is that it comes out of the land. You know, we were observers of nature, and we used those in our designs. And so really what I've been doing is trying to focus on more of those shapes and enlarge them and make them more part of the kind of work. And it's interesting that it's kind of like, it's abstract, but it still tells that story. And that's what really interests me, because, you know, we're connected to thousands and thousands of years of history that, you know, we don't know exactly where those designs came from, but we can observe where they came from. And that's sort of where my interest lies, is like this, it's sort of like connected to this really long history. And exploring it through art is like kind of the way that we can bring it back to life, right? It was really close, like Coast Salish art was really close to being gone compared to our northern relatives. They had form line, which was studied a lot more and is also a lot more internationally recognized. So yeah, that's been sort of my job, is to kind of educate people and bring that more to the forefront of the conversation, because this is the land that we live on. This is the designs come from this land. Yeah, so it's all connected that way.
Thank you. Michelle, would you like to do a round?
I think, I guess we're kind of like starting to finish the conversation, or? But I would like to invite or propose you, because I was reading about this article that this river in Quebec had an entity. It has now an entity and the right to appeal and to be protected. So I was attracted to the idea of let's change the word resource, and instead of research, let's speak about entity. Maybe that could help us to not only us, of course, but all our people to understand the value of and the misconception of the word resource, and how it has been misused through capitalism and rational thinking, and to disrespect Mother Nature. So I would love to propose you to depart from resource towards entity. Maybe that could help us all.
No, I know myself, I couldn't agree more. And I think even today you've heard me sort of delineate between the two, of speaking of as a resource as how the westernized way of looking at it, as opposed to the way we were taught, your homok, that's your mother. And she, you know, the one who creates and looks after you. So of course she's an entity, not only just an entity, your relative, your closest relative, who will be there to welcome you into the world and to welcome you home when your time goes to go back to be into the spirit world. It's all there. I mean, when we talk about when we go back into the earth for and that's a stage, because our funerary rites, going into the earth to be buried comes much, much later than after you passed away. You go into a box, you go into your bones and these sort of things. So that's the final stage of going home to be with mother, and then you weave the blanket of earth over top. So you take those things into consideration, right? I know the transition of time and our understanding and our perception and how we've been fighting, even in the legal system, for many years. This is where the Sparrow case came in, you know, the Aboriginal right to fish, and you need to consult, right? In fact, they even call it the Sparrow test now for consultation. Have you gone over? That's the federal government's checkbox now. It's called the Sparrow, you know, test. Another entity that was granted was actually in New Zealand. Our Maori relatives won a court case, and one of their rivers was granted the same rights as a person, to be protected as a person. Our Maori relatives were actually up here visiting my uncle, my late uncle Delbert Guerin, who was the chief at the time, for the Guerin decision in Musqueam, which at the end of it was over a bad deal that the government had made on our behalf over a golf course, Shaughnessy golf course. So we won that the government had not had a breach of duty. They had a fiduciary responsibility to look after us. If they were going to call us wards of the crown, they had a fiduciary responsibility to look after us and speak on our behalf, in our best interest, rather than just do what they did. This has deeper rooted than just the court case for over a golf course. This starts to root into, if you're going to say that you're the ruling government, right, and you are the one in charge of all of these resources, you better be looking after them, because we're connected to them with everyone's best intention, and right now for Indigenous people's best intention, which then led into the Sparrow case before. Maori relatives actually came to visit my uncle Delbert to talk about the case, because they wanted to cite it as a Commonwealth case in that case that they had in New Zealand over that. So you can see where this Indigenous way of knowing how you're connected to the earth. And I mean, if you go to any Indigenous population, you're not going to hear too far a story When you're connected to the earth, you're connected to the earth. Some of the little nuances might be different, and of course they are, because mom needs to be treated differently when you're talking about her hair or you're talking about her elbow. But nobody looks after her heart or her hair as best as the people who have always been there. So absolutely, when we talk about, traditionally we speak, it is our mother. It is her blood that the rivers flow through, the nutrients that flow through the blood, those are our salmon, all these sort of things, and understanding how that works. And it is actually very much like that colonial thing of removing those thoughts away, then it becomes a resource. I could cut all my mother's hair off and turn it into rope. Of course I could. But is that respectful? And is it, how long can that keep up? How long will she want to let that happen? Right? But when you disassociate yourself long enough, then you can turn it into a resource and then convert it into this modern version of what capital is to people now. So it's a very, very different ideology. And unfortunately, you need trees to breathe, you need water to drink, and you need food to eat. And people have been told the lie that those resources are unlimited, and they very, very well are not. So.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you for all the words and thoughts and thinking. I guess now it's time for Denise to close. And
Or at least James would like to say around to close as well.
No, I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity to come here and speak on my work, and I've really enjoyed being part of this conversation and hearing Morgan, my cousin Morgan, talk about this. It's been also, it's good to hear it coming from people in my community as well, because it's not every day that we have these conversations. So I'm just really glad to be a part of this and looking forward to more of this work that you guys are doing. It's really interesting. And yeah, I was looking at the virtual image of the salmon skull, and I thought that was really interesting about how you could sort of make it like this virtual reality where you're up and close with or inside of this this work. Yeah, it's like a work of art. You're in it and you're engaged in seeing what it's like. And I found that really interesting. So yeah, just keep up the good work, and just, yeah, thanks again.
Thank you, James. I invite you both to go and see the exhibition, and I look forward, if you have any feedback or observation or comment, I'm really, really looking forward to keeping the contact, to continuing the conversation, of course. And just to mention that skull is from a wild salmon in Norway, and is taken as a sculpture. So it's kind of like a virtual sculpture.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. The other side of my family is actually from Norway. My mom's side of the family's from Norway. And it's very interesting on a whole other TED Talk about the conversation of traditional salmon versus the farm salmon of Norway, which is the same conversation we're having here. So yes, but it's been an honor. I want to thank every one of you for setting this up, and to those who tune into as well, to thank them as well for their time with our people. My cousin and I were always taught, when you have guests in your home, it's one of the greatest honors you can have, especially those who come to learn a bit about you. And through this virtual platform, we've got the whole world able to come and say hello. So I'd like to thank everyone too for their time there.
Thank you. I would like to pass it to Denise, that is the host of the whole circle. If you have a last question or comment, or would you like to embrace us all?
Of course, I'd like to embrace you all. Yeah, I'm going to keep it again short and thank everyone because I am glad that everybody could spare some time today to have this conversation, and I've enjoyed quietly watching for the most part, and all of the conversations leading up to this and getting to know again you, Morgan, and James, and Michelle-Marie through this project, and of course reconnecting with Paz. It's one of the best parts of working at Or Gallery is to create a platform for these connections and to be able to just enjoy the brilliance and the intelligence and the knowledge and everything that I'm lucky enough to have access to in this role, and to be able to share with a wider group of guests, visitors, what you may call them. So thank you, everyone. Really, it's and thanks for starting your day earlier or ending your day very much later. In the case of you, Paz and Michelle-Marie, it's quite late there. So thanks again for doing that. And I look forward to working with you all or meeting you all again in some way. So yeah.
So let's do a collective thank you, I think, no? So to...
In a honor.
Yeah, Morgan, James, Denise, Michelle-Marie, that we are talking so long already.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Tsepka.